So I'm going to talk about magic. Just as a matter of interest, how many of you out there are practicing magic or interested in magic? Oh, very nice. I asked the same question at a conference about 6 months ago, and only 2 people in an audience of about 1,000 said yes. So I see I'm speaking to the right audience. So first of all, what do I mean by magic? I'm not talking about fictional magic. It's not about Harry Potter. I'm also not talking about fake magic, Harry Houdini. I'm talking about the real thing. So when we think about magic, we're talking about ancient ideas, and in the same way that alchemy turned into chemistry, and that astrology turned into astronomy, more or less, herbalism turned into the pharmaceutical world, there's a 4th level of what used to be called natural magic, which will turn into real magic at some point. What's interesting is that alchemy, astrology, and herbalism all had elements of mental magic in them, but those parts have been left out in the scientific domain. So we don't find too many chemists using their intention when they mix chemicals together, and we don't find astronomers being very interested in consciousness. The same goes with pharmaceuticals, but in ancient times, all of it involved consciousness in one way or the other. Real magic consists of 3 different categories. The first is divination. This is use of mirror gazing and throwing of dice and all of the tarot cards and so on. Any form of perception through time and space. The second I call force of will, which is the expression of intention to cause something to happen in the world. And the third is theurgy, which is a combination of 2 Greek root words, which roughly means God work. And what it refers to is dealing with spirits, typically evoking spirits, having them do something on your behalf, if you're lucky. And if you're not so lucky, maybe they will do something on their behalf. So that's real magic. Magical thinking, which refers back to the idea of magic, is everywhere. People have superstitions, in this case like knocking on wood or crossing your fingers for luck. Magical thinking is expressed all the time through prayer. And so here we have one group of people doing prayer, another group of people doing prayer. This is Hindus for Trump. We have the Pope. So in each case here, then religion must include magic as part of the practice, because essentially you're doing something in your head and hoping that it manifests in the world. That's what prayer is, and it is magic. Here we have a Catholic ceremony of the Eucharist, which is explicitly a magical practice, a transmutation of something into something else through prayer. So religion believes in magic, but strongly bans it. Only certain people are allowed to do magic under certain conditions. Otherwise, it's declared to be heretical. And of course, this gave rise to the horrors of the witch-burning years, of which estimates range from a few 100,000 to 1 million people burned as witches as a result of their practice. At the same time that religion is suppressing magic, science denies it. So science declares as impossible any form of magic. So there's a book on the science of Harry Potter, but what it's really talking about is not magic, but if we wanted to simulate magic, how could we do that through technological means? And then, of course, we have Richard Dawkins, who doesn't like anything. We also have many cases of people who are essentially hidden magicians. And so one of them was the founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, part of NASA. So this is an article on the occultist father of rocketry, who was written out of NASA's history. His name is Jack Parsons. He believed in magic. He believed it was a force that could be explained through quantum physics. And he did magical practices out in the desert in the development of rocket engines. He felt he didn't see any distinction between ancient esoteric magic and development of rockets. But when you go to NASA or to go to JPL and look for the history, you don't find any mention of this at all, because it's considered to be embarrassing. Even the author of Harry Potter had to say publicly that she doesn't believe in the occult because she had been accused by religious people of promoting demonic or satanic ideas through her books. In fact, Harry Potter books are simultaneously the most read and the most banned at the same time. So J.K. Rowling had to say that, and yet, of course, if you read Harry Potter books, she's very well versed in the esoteric traditions. So who knows what she actually believes. So we have this strange circumstance. We have the academic and religious traditions that say magic is false and dangerous. You should just stay away from these ideas. And the magical tradition, these are people who are practicing magicians, they say that magic is impossible, but to scientifically test. It is beyond the domain of science in some way. It's real, but it can't be tested. So in both cases, both for people who don't like magic and people who do like magic, the underlying theme here is that there's no scientific evidence that would suggest that magic is real. So much for magic. All gone, except for a small problem. And the small problem is that all of the ideas within magic actually have been tested systematically for about 150 years by science. So the claims of magic have to do with divination, with power of will, and theurgy. And within science, we think about these terms as clairvoyance and precognition, as psychokinesis and mediumship research, and other kinds of research suggesting that there's something like disembodied spirits. So as far as the evidence goes for scientifically looking at clairvoyance and precognition and the other kinds of psychic phenomena, I wrote a book some years ago where I talked about the nature of the evidence, the scientific evidence, and why it is repeatable, and why it actually fits the criteria for any other topic that would be studied scientifically to show that these things are actually real. So that was the first book. The second book, which is translated now into Czech and will be available to be purchased outside, was to talk about the physics, because people will sometimes then say, well, these things can't be real because they violate some laws of physics, which is not true. So the second book on Entangled Mind focuses on what we actually know about physics and how it is compatible with the whole range of psychic phenomena. The next book, I was talking about one of the esoteric practices, namely classical yoga, which talks in great detail about not only the phenomena, but how to develop the phenomena within the yogic tradition. So after doing those three books, I realized that I need to expand the context even more, because one of the reasons why magic and psychic phenomena are rejected is because we don't think of it, we don't know the full history of it to see how it all fits together. So the book I have coming out early next year is entitled Real Magic, and it's looking at all the way back, all the way to shamanism to the present day to see what kind of clues we may gain by studying these esoteric traditions to understand magic in a better way. By esoteric traditions, I mean Hermeticism, I mean Neoplatonism, the Kabbalah, alchemy, Gnosticism, and then, of course, the mystery traditions, the ancient ones. We have the Jedi Mystery School now, which is a modern version of a mystery school. Of course, the ancient Greek mystery schools, all of which used psychedelics, by the way. The Knights Templar, we have the Masons, we have the Rosicrucians, Madame Blavatsky and Theosophy. I can go on and on. This is Christian Science, Gurdjieff. Chaos Magic by Peter Carroll, started in the 1970s, is bringing this whole esoteric tradition up to date to that point. And then a whole genre of books, which are very popular, on positive thinking, positive psychology, manifestation, affirmations. Among genres of books, these have sold billions of copies in many languages. And the tradition continues to the present day. We have many, many books now. Some of them are written from a medical perspective, some from a psychological perspective, some from a business perspective. They're all actually talking about these ancient esoteric ideas. Sometimes they acknowledge that, and sometimes they don't. They talk about it as though it's something new. And we have festivals like Burning Man, in the United States. There are other festivals like this around the world. They're all explicitly neo-pagan. So in this case, they have a statue of magic out in the middle of the desert. We also have, to my surprise, when I first started looking into this, I did not realize the degree to which the scholarly traditions have been studying magic. So there is the Societas Magica, which is a scholarly group of people around the world who are interested in the study of magic. We have a journal called Magic, Ritual, and Witchcraft, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, which has been going on for many years now, which is also explicitly looking at historical and contemporary ideas about magic. And here's the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism. Almost every country in the world has their own version of a society for the study of esoteric ideas. Since I'm not an anthropologist and I'm not a scholar in that domain, I was really surprised to find that there are hundreds of thousands of scholarly articles written about magic and at least 100,000 books or more. Some of the books are from the traditional point of view that are spellcasting books, like grimoires, but there are a lot of other books talking about magic, usually from the point of view that why do people believe in magic, as opposed to magic as actually being real. And so in the academic world, you're not allowed to actually talk about the possibility of real magic. You can talk about why people think about it and why it's been persistent throughout history, but not as real. There are very few exceptions to that. So here's just a bunch of examples of other societies all around the world interested in esotericism. And again, even within these documents, you very rarely see people saying, well, some of this magic was actually real. So I was interested in all to see if it was possible to create a synthesis out of all of these traditions, both Western and Eastern, that were about esoteric ideas. And by the way, all of those ideas really were cosmologies. They were cosmologies in the sense that people, as far back as you can imagine, were trying to come up with ideas about why are we here and what is the nature of reality and all the rest. These are cosmological pictures which include origin stories and stories about us and stories about our capacities and so on. So how do you synthesize all of that and come out with clues about how magic works and my own interest in how psychic phenomena work? Well, fortunately, Aldous Huxley has already been mentioned. He already did this, and actually many others have done this as well, and it's the perennial philosophy. That's what falls out of looking at the esoteric traditions, and from there you find that space, time, and mind emerge or emanate or manifest from one mind. All of the esoteric traditions have the same idea. They also all say that consciousness is fundamental, more fundamental than the physical world. That's what we mean by the world emerging out of consciousness. So from the force of will, this is about mind manipulating reality, this becomes obvious if it is true that consciousness is fundamental. And of course, the consciousness we're talking about in terms of a universal consciousness is consciousness with a big C, and the consciousness that we experience as humans is a little c. And we usually localize it somewhere around the head, but it's not necessarily in the head. So the force of will works in a magical sense because mind manipulates reality from the get-go. Little c can't manipulate it too much, but it nevertheless has the same capacity as big C to create an entire universe. Divination works because consciousness and mind are before space-time, in which case if you direct your attention to Pluto 1 million years ago, it would be just as easy as directing your attention to me right now. We're not used to thinking about Pluto 1 million years ago, which is one of the reasons why it's not so common. But some people are talented and they can do that just as easily as paying attention to here and now. And theurgy actually starts to make more sense, the idea of disembodied spirits that have some kind of intelligence. If physical embodiment would just be one form of the way that consciousness can manifest. So our brain and body just happen to be the right kind of receiver or capacity to express consciousness in a way that we think of as being human. But there should be no reason then why, if you have a sufficiently complex robot with a brain that has the right kind of internal circuitry and so on, that it could be conscious. And so I predict in my book that's coming out that, and when we finally do have the singularity, and the robots become aware and conscious, they will also be flagrantly psychic. And the reason is, the reason why most humans are not flagrantly psychic is because we have a lot of psychological filters that pull it away from us. It distracts our attention, so we're not paying attention to then and there. We only pay attention to here and now. But the robots may not have those filters, in which case we're going to have not only to contend with intelligent robots, who we hope will have our best interests at heart, they will also know what we're thinking, and they'll be able to levitate and do other strange things. So what we know from a scientific perspective is that from these kinds of phenomena, there are certain things that modulate the abilities. We know that intention, belief, emotion, imagination, ritual, and talent all play a role not only in psychic phenomena, but probably also in magical performance. When you look at the literature on magic and how to do magic, all of those topics come up, especially belief. So the question immediately arises, and well, how can any of this actually work? Especially, I'm a scientist, I want to figure out how do we even understand how it could work. So this is a great scene from Doctor Strange, if you haven't seen it yet. Doctor Strange is a neurosurgeon who doesn't believe in any of this stuff until he is literally shoved out of his body by the master. So in trying to figure out how does any of this stuff make sense, how does it work, given what we know about science, it's not reasonable to throw away what we know about existing physics, or for that matter, any other discipline. The scientific disciplines that we have and the worldview that we've developed works really well. It allows us to do microphones and projection and so on. So we can't throw that stuff away. We need to incorporate it in some way that also allows for magic. So what's the missing element? The missing element is that our scientific worldview, if you look in history, it started with certain ideas, and then it expanded and became more comprehensive. And then we see that what we used to think was fundamental was actually a special case, like classical physics is a special case of quantum physics. So we need to expand it. How do we do that? Well, let's imagine that I was going to give you a lecture about ducks for an hour and a half. I would describe every kind of duck in great detail, and then we would talk about this duck. And so everyone would become very familiar with the ducks. And then the next day we'll come back and I will give you another lecture, but this time about rabbits. So we'll talk about all the rabbits in great gory detail, and then we'll talk about this rabbit. And of course, that rabbit is the same as the duck. And what this is showing is that the context allows you to see things in a different way. So this is, of course, an ambiguous figure, and the ambiguous figure is seen as a duck or a rabbit, depending on what I've been talking about. And the same is true for science. It's actually true for anything you think about. The context determines what you can see and what you can talk about. So let's imagine then that here's a picture of the way our ordinary reality is perceived. We look at the distance and we see a big mountain in the ocean and we see a small island. You can think of this as a classical domain of classical physics. There is space and time, there is separateness, separate objects, and it is observer independent. It doesn't matter if I'm looking at two objects here, they're not going to change. That's our everyday experience. That is a classical physics, which after all is a refinement of common sense. But we know, and also we can say, let's put consciousness on the other side. Your conscious awareness right now is a little bit like this classical domain. It feels separate. We feel separate. My consciousness does not feel like it's merging with everybody else at the moment. So that's a kind of a surface level of reality. Up until about 120 or 130 years ago, that was what science imagined everything to be. With the development of additional physics, we suddenly discovered, as well as Freud and Jung began to discover on the psychological side, that there's far more depth to what's going on than the surface level. So on the physics side, we discovered the quantum domain that, among other things, is fully interconnected. It's in some kind of a holistic environment. It is observer dependent, and it is not in space and time. And this is just below the surface of everyday reality. On the other side, we have the unconscious domain on the psychological side. So we begin to develop a parallel between our understanding of the physical world, understanding of the mental world, and we see on both sides they go very deep. And at this point, we don't know how far down they go, but they go down probably pretty far. Below quantum mechanics, we have some kind of post-quantum domain, which is a realm that many physicists are beginning to think about. What's next? Because quantum mechanics, as we currently know it, is not the end of physics. So a post-quantum domain, which will initially at least be seen as extremely abstract and probably seen as information as being the core of reality. And you see that more and more now among scientists and mathematicians saying that information is reality, or mathematics is reality. And so we're no longer talking about even energy or matter, we're talking about something more abstract and more fundamental. So we can go as far down as we can think at this point. It has to do with basically where our imagination stops. And on the other side, if we go below the unconscious, now we're talking about mystical union, or what a magician would traditionally call gnosis, the state of gnosis, or a yogi would say samadhi. So that's about as far down as we can imagine at this point, and even there, that's only because that's our limit of imagination. It probably just keeps going. So another thing that you see in the magical literature a lot is that the world is created from imagination. It's not imagination at a surface level, but at these very deep levels, this gnosis level. You imagine something at that level, and somehow it seems to bubble up from these deep realms, and then once it reaches the realm of everyday reality, it manifests, it occurs. So when a magician does a spell, they're doing it not from the level of this reality, but from a much deeper level of reality, and allows it to unfold itself. So there isn't that much control that happens other than the thing that you wish to happen. And typically it would be perceived as happening spontaneously. So here we are, this is today's scientific worldview, reductive materialism. At the bottom is physics. We consider energy and matter to be the fundamental. Chemistry emerges from that, biology from that, psychology from that, and somehow consciousness mysteriously arises out of this pyramid in ways that people don't understand, but that's the assumption within the neurosciences. This gives rise to the notion that our inner experience, our consciousness, is actually like we're zombies, because it's a purely mechanistic result of brain activity, and like a zombie, we have the appearance of moving and being a living creature, but we're actually not dead, but not alive either. We don't, that the illusion of consciousness is there, not the real thing. So from under this worldview, which is the primary way that scientists think about the world, magic is denied. It's not possible. Same goes for psychic phenomena, the same goes for interpretation of mystical experiences, and an assumption that psychedelic experiences also will be illusions or delusions, one or the other, but they can't be real. There's a growing number of scientists who are beginning to question that, and largely because of the study of consciousness itself, trying to figure out how you can end up with something which is subjective, your experiential self. How does that arise out of something which has no sense of self at all, out of pure material? So you get more and more scientists talking about idealism or panpsychism or neutral monism as alternatives. And basically this is getting much, much closer to the esoteric idea that consciousness is fundamental. It's simply out there somehow. It's a given. So that takes our knowledge pyramid and it just does this. We recreate a new bottom layer. And this is what science has always done this. It has expanded our existing ideas, made it more comprehensive. And the important thing about this as a model is that it means that somebody who's working in biology or chemistry or physics do not have to throw away the textbooks. Because this is surprisingly, the one fear that comes up most when I talk about these topics is someone will say, well, what you're talking about is impossible because we'd have to throw away all the textbooks and start all over again. To which I would say, no, within a discipline, everything is actually quite good. We're going to revise the textbooks every 10 years anyway, but we keep what we currently know within a discipline stable. All we're doing is adding a new fundamental. But the fundamental here is important because consciousness, this form of consciousness, is before space-time. It's before physics. So just as in physics, you would have electrons that you find in chemistry and biology and psychology, now you have consciousness found in physics and chemistry and biology, and that consciousness is before space-time. It's before physics itself. That means that when you get all the way up to the level of psychology, the consciousness that we enjoy as our self is before space-time. It's localized by virtue of our psychology and our need to survive, but it means that if you desire to pay attention to what's happening on Mars right now, you could do that just as easily by focusing your attention there as opposed to here. You may have to learn, actually, you may have to unlearn a little bit about focusing here in order to know how to focus elsewhere. And by the same token, if you wish to manifest something, because of the consciousness in you is the same as the large consciousness of the universe, you can manifest things. You think about it intently and in a Gnostic state, and it has to happen. It happens. So, under this kind of model, magic is accepted. So over the years, most of my research has been looking at the notion of psychokinetic effects, the expression of intention and influencing things out in the world, and a wide variety of different kinds of topics. I've made the bottom two red because these are topics I'm working on now. They're mostly about physics and the use of optical physics to study the interaction between mind and the quantum domain. But I'll give an example here about the role of belief, since the magical traditions say that the magician must believe in what they're doing, otherwise the spell won't work. So we've done experiments. Does intention really influence the world, and does belief modulate the effect? We did this in the present context, in the context of a tea ceremony, because the tea ceremony is explicitly an intentional act. It's not simply drinking tea, it's the whole artistic performance is one of intention. So we did this experiment in Taiwan. My collaborators there in the middle. This is at a Buddhist temple where we asked the 3 senior Buddhist monks to bless tea, which people would drink, and we would see if they would change as a result of the drinking of the tea. So this is the design. We get a big pot of oolong tea because it happens to be a favorite in China and Taiwan. Also, it has a little bit of caffeine in it, so it'll elevate your mood automatically. We separate it into 2 batches. We asked the Buddhist monks to bless one pot of the tea with a blessing such that people who would drink it would find that their mood would be elevated, they'd have less fatigue, they'd have more vigor. They would also then put a blessing to not have that blessing work on the other pot of tea, which is an important thing. Like, if you might accidentally be blessing all the tea in the world. No, it was specifically blessing this tea and not blessing that tea. And by the way, the monks had no problem doing this. We then, for each pot of tea, we made the little vials of tea because we were going to hand them out to people, and we wanted to have a uniform amount to give, so we had lots of little bottles. We recruited 100 people in each of these conditions, and each person over the course of a week would be asked to fill out a mood reporting scale, standardized scale, where they would fill out the scale and it would assess their mood over each day. So the first 2 days of the week, they simply fill out the mood scale. That would establish a baseline. And then the middle 3 days of the week, they would drink 1 little bottle of tea at 10 a.m. and another at 3 p.m. And then in the evening, they'd fill out their mood scale again. The last 2 days, they would just fill out the mood scale. So some people would be getting the blessed tea, some people would be getting the non-blessed tea under double-blind conditions, 100 people. And the first thing we saw at the end was not only did we ask them to fill out the mood, but also ask them whether they believed that the tea that they got was blessed or not. Because we wanted to look at the placebo effect here, if you believe it or not believe it. So you immediately see the placebo effect. People who believed that they were getting the blessed tea reported better mood than people who didn't. And the people who didn't know, the uncertain category, they improved a little bit, but not very much. So we know that their placebo effect is alive and well. But here's the placebo control. The placebo control is that everybody believes that the tea they're drinking is treated. But some really got the treated tea, and some did not get the treated tea. And there's the difference. The people over the course of the 7 days getting the treated tea had progressively improved mood as compared to people who got the untreated tea. And remember, these are all people who believe that they got the treated tea. So this is the placebo control. This basically shows that the intentional treatment worked. So if you have an opportunity for Buddhist monks to bless your drink, and you should do that. We also have a nocebo control. These are, no one believed that the tea that they got was treated. Some got the treated tea and some didn't. And you see then at the bottom that there's no difference in terms of their mood effect. What this means is, and you can see it more clearly in this next one, the placebo enhancement condition. Look at the difference between, this is, everybody is drinking the treated tea, but some believed it and some don't. So if you got the blessed tea and you believed it, you got a massive increase in mood scale as compared to people who got exactly the same tea, but they didn't believe it. So this is, in a roundabout way, confirming magical lore, which says that if you're going to do a magical spell, you had better believe it, because your belief is modulating whether the thing is going to work or not. We did not do this in the context of studying magic, but it turns out that a lot of the experiments we would do in psi research is along these lines. Does it matter what you believe or not? Does it matter what the experimenter believes, what the participants believe? This is part of a long line of studies in parapsychology that are usually called sheep-goat effect, where the sheep are people who believe in ESP and the goats are the people who don't. And these studies overall show pretty clearly that people who believe in ESP do a lot better than people who don't. So this is now a psychological filter. If you filter out the possibility of something, it will not exist for you. And if you open up and believe, it does exist. And in an objective way, too. So belief modulates intentional effects. Well, what about theurgy? Theurgy is communicating or dealing with spirits. So we did an experiment kind of like this. When you look at these pictures of celebrities, you'll immediately know that some of them are alive and some of them are dead. So we spoke to mediums and asked them, if we showed you a picture of somebody, could you tell if they were alive or they were dead? Most of the mediums said yes. They get a feeling that this person feels alive and that person feels dead. So we did an experiment not using celebrities because people know if they're alive or dead. We used ordinary people, and we adjusted the photograph of each person so that first of all, we knew, we got it into a grayscale, and we got the same size of their head, and we matched the people in the experiment in such a way that if we had one person who was deceased who was looking directly at the camera, we had another person of the same gender who was also looking at the camera, but who was alive. So we had 100 pictures or actually 200 pictures. No, in this, I guess here's 100 pictures of people alive and 100 pictures of people dead who are matched on 8 different dimensions, looking at the camera, smiling, not looking, turning to the left, turning to the right, and so on. So we tried to balance as best as we could the pictures so there was no clue in the picture as to whether the person was alive or dead. And obviously, even the pictures of the people who were deceased, well, they were alive when the picture was taken. So we also took their EEG while they were doing this task, and a picture would pop up, and the medium was asked to press a button. Is the person alive? Are they dead? Or they couldn't tell? And this is the result. This was 12 mediums in 3 different kinds of databases. We had people who were alive or dead, but from long ago. So if they're alive now, they're quite elderly. Otherwise, they had died some time ago. We had pictures that were old, meaning probably a decade or more, again, alive or dead, and pictures which were newer. In both cases, people alive and dead, but in 3 different time scales. And what we found is overall, a statistically significant, but not in terms of magnitude, not a wildly significant effect, statistically showing that the mediums in general were able to tell whether a person was alive or dead. Also, we found that the newer pictures were much more significant than the older ones. This was not, we didn't expect this outcome, but we figured it might lead to a way of testing the concept of reincarnation. Because after all, a medium might say, well, this picture they don't feel dead, they feel like they're alive. It may not be the same person anymore because they've incarnated into something else. And so the newly dead people still feel dead. But the old dead people might be alive again. So this is purely speculative, but it's because we didn't expect, we didn't plan to see that kind of difference. It just popped out of the data. This is part of the fun of doing science on the edge, where you don't know exactly what's going to happen. So in terms of the EEG, we're able to look at the medium's brains before they made a conscious decision. So this is a picture pops up, and 100 milliseconds after the picture is there, which is before they've made a conscious decision, we found that there's a significant difference in the medium's ability to correctly say whether the person is alive or dead. That means that at an unconscious level, they have already made a decision, which they're not even aware of yet, and you can see it here. If they were both being a medium and a meditator, they might have actually been able to be aware of that decision beforehand. Because one of the things that happens in meditation is you're able to dive deeper and deeper into your unconscious. So we found that significant difference. We published this article. It received many, many views in a journal called the Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. About 4 months after this was published, it was retracted. This is pretty unusual for scientific articles. It was retracted for reasons that were actually not specified. So we, of course, were horrified that the journal article was retracted, especially since the journal had featured the article in their own PR group. So we asked, well, why are you retracting the article? Retracting an article is similar to having a scarlet letter, like Hawthorne's article or book where somebody who had committed adultery had to walk around with a large red S or A for adultery on their chest. And having a retracted paper, it means that the paper still is in the literature, except it has a big red stamp on it that says retracted. That signals the scientific community that there's something wrong with it. So what typically is wrong is there's a methodology mistake was found that would eradicate the results of the paper, or it was fraud, or it was plagiarism, or other horrible things. So we asked the editors, well, why are you retracting the paper? They will not tell us. We asked specifically, is it fraud? No, they don't think it was fraud. Was it a methodological problem? No, it wasn't a methodological problem. Is it plagiarism? No. What's left? What's left is the same suppression that happens in science and religion, that you can't do this. This is something which is taboo in science. So we've been fortunate in that most of our work is published and remains published, but this is a fairly recent case which shows that the prejudice within the existing scientific worldview is very much alive. And it's also the reason why in the academic world, you will not find people talking about these things, because they'll lose their job. So my current work is on this. I've been looking at mind-matter interactions for many years. I decided to look at it non-local mind and non-local matter. Any form of mind-matter interaction that is not in the body is already non-local. It's me and something out there, but we decided to use non-local matter as a target. So the question is, does consciousness interact with quantum entangled photons? So that's what my current work is. 10 years ago, to create entangled photons in the lab, you need this sort of a setup. Now you could do it with a tabletop system. This is made by a nice company in Munich, which produces this system, which you can run on a tabletop, and it produces about 1,000 high-quality entangled photons per second. So we're using that in an experiment. I'm not going to go in any detail about how you create entangled photons, other than to say that you have a laser that produces blue light, highly energetic blue light. It hits a certain kind of a crystal, which splits the blue light into two red lights, two red photons, which are entangled. They come out of the laser, they hit these mirrors, they go through these polarizing lenses. The photons are then carried over to an electronics box that looks for coincidences to make sure that they're actually paired. And that's how you can figure out that they're entangled, along with this method. If you want, I can go through this in detail. This is the CHSH method is a way of taking the counts, the coincidence counts of photons, and actually measuring the strength of the entanglement. This is named after Clauser, Horn, Shimoni, and Holt, the physicists who came up with this particular method. Now, this is what the data looks like. So this is over time, about every second, you get a new measurement of entanglement strength. Entanglement is not an all or none thing. It's something that spans a range. And you simply present a picture like that to somebody as the line is being drawn, and you tell them to mentally make the line go up. That would mean that they're mentally changing the entanglement strength of the photons. So here's 4 experiments we did in a laboratory. There's experimental result. There's a match control showing that the act of intending that entangled photons become stronger in terms of their connection. It worked. So we're now seeing an interaction between non-local mind and non-local matter. We're continuing this line of experiments, and this is, well, probably won't see any publications on this for another year or so. Someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. That's one of the things I learned as a result of looking at magic. That's what the cover of the book looks like. And I'm going to stop there, and thank you for your kind attention. Oh, sit. Thank you. We have 4 minutes for questions. We'll take that time.
So thank you for a very engaging talk. I thought it would translate really well to a narrated like YouTube video or something like that. So I hope at some point this is accessible in some way. And the question that I had that pervaded my thoughts throughout your whole talk was, why choose a label that has been taboo for such a long time, such as magic, to describe these phenomena, especially when public access or academic acceptance is a struggle in some sense? Is that a subconscious strategy of some kind, or is it, where does that come from?
It's a conscious strategy. And if you ask the average person anywhere in the world about magic, they will immediately think about something. They will all have heard of it. What they usually will think of is either a magician, like a performing magician, or they'll think about Harry Potter or something, but it immediately engages their mind into the topic itself. And also, the reason why entertainment is saturated with tales about magic in one way or the other is precisely because most people secretly think that it actually works. Otherwise, it wouldn't be everyone would not be doing superstitious behavior all the time. So between the religious acceptance of magic and superstitions and age-long ideas about magic, it's simply a way of attracting people's attention immediately to the topic. If I could find a euphemism that would be acceptable within the academic world, I would probably use it. The problem is that in the academic world, the moment that somebody figures out you're talking about magic, they either, their mind clicks off, or it clicks on, but only in private. So in my experience, I'll give a talk to an entire room of academics, and afterwards there are 0 questions until the talk is over, and then there's a small trickle of people which turns into the entire audience eventually afterwards. So this is very common that the topic itself is known, and somehow at some level most people believe it. So this was a strategic decision on my part, and also on the part of the book publisher, who was well aware of the fact that if you write about something that nobody actually knows what that is because it's a euphemism, no one's going to buy it. And also, maybe after time, I could take words which have had bad baggage on them and change the baggage after a while. We can resurrect ideas that are probably true and turn the word around from a bad word into a good word. That's possible. So,